Alright, for this one I'm going to show you how to use a plaster mold in order to make a platter. There are two types of mold. There is what is called a drape mold, which is what this is, where you drape the clay over the mold and then cut it out. There's also what's called a slump mold, which would be a negative, so that if you wanted to do a bowl, the bowl would be cut out of the mold and then you'd slump the clay into that mold and it would take the form of that. This works pretty well because I'm able to do the bottom and put feet on it right away, and then all I need to do is let it dry once I cut it and assemble the bottom. So I've rolled out a slab already. I've let it dry just a little bit so it's not too wet. I've put my mold onto a bat on a banding wheel so that I can easily move it around, and it raises it up off the surface if I want to go off the edge a little bit. I also have my template that I'm going to use to cut my plate out. For this particular one, I would raku this platter so that it's more of a decorative plate that you would use and put dry things in. It's not food safe in the raku process. So with my drape mold set where I want it, this time I can pick up my slab because it's stiffened up a little bit with two hands, and I can drape it over my mold like this, and I'm just going to press it down around my mold. Now I have a lot of excess clay that's hanging off the edge, which is fine because it's better to have more than I need than not enough. Now I want to probably slide this over just a little bit more. It's a little forgiving so I can reposition as I need to. But again, I just want to press this down onto the mold all the way around so it takes the shape of the mold. And I don't really have any gaps between the clay and the mold itself. So the molds are made of plaster, so as you are doing this, that plaster is going to absorb the moisture, kind of like it did with when you made sprigs, which is going to help dry it out a little bit faster. If I were to use a different kind of mold and I let this dry in it and it doesn't have room to shrink, it can cause cracking. But with a drape mold like this, it can dry on here for a little bit until it gets leather hard, and you're not going to have to worry about the mold cracking the piece because it's trying to go places it shouldn't go. So before I cut my template, I'm just going to cut the excess off the outside. Again, I'm not cutting down onto my mold, I'm just cutting the excess off the edge. So I'm using my mold a little bit as my edge for where I want to cut this. I can also kind of see on my clay where the edge of the mold is. Then as long as there isn't any plaster in your clay, this clay can be recycled. So I'm going to set that off to the side so I can put it into the recycling bin later. So I'm going to continue pressing this down, making sure that it's on there well and I don't really have any gaps in there. And I can do this all with hand. I don't need to use my rib or anything else to press it on. Once it's on there securely, I can take my template, and my template's not going to bend to this shape because my template isn't going to be round. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold my template in place and I'm going to use my knife along the edge of my template, and I'm just going to cut. I don't want to press too hard, I want to just go far enough to cut through the clay. If I press too hard, I'll end up leaving marks on the mold, which I really want to avoid in this case. Okay, so once I have it cut, then what I want to do is I want to take this excess off. And again, as long as there isn't plaster on it, it's something that you can easily put in the recycling bin and we can use for later. Now that I'm left with this, I need some sort of foot for it. Because it's a constant curve, if I were to put this on a surface or a table, it would just kind of wobble. So I want to make some sort of foot for it. And rather than doing a full foot ring and trying to figure out where that goes, I'm going to use some sprigs as my feet. So when I do this, I'm only going to use 3. And the reason I only want to use 3 is if I use 4, if it sits on 4, you need to make sure all 4 sprigs are exactly the same height. Otherwise, you may have one that kind of wobbles off. 3 instead works like a tripod, and it will rest on the highest point of each of the 3 feet. So when I do this, I want to kind of evenly place them so that I know where they're going to sit and where this is going to rest on. I can always take a board, probably not this template because it's curved, but I can take a board and I can rest it there so I know like how it would sit in relation to a flat surface. Then I'm going to mark where my sprigs go. And I just made these sprigs ahead of time so that they set up a little bit and they're a little bit stiffer so I can attach them right away. And they don't necessarily need to be this big either. You could do smaller sprigs. You just want to make sure that this middle part is up off the surface when you do this. And try and evenly space them out so that you know where they're going to go. So I'm going to attach these then one at a time so that I know exactly where they're going to go and I don't mix up which sprig is going to go where. So I grab my container of slip off the shelf. I'm going to use my serrated rib again from my toolbox to score the bottoms. And you'll notice on these sprigs, because they're large, I also hollowed out the bottom. When I hollow these out, I'm going to need to poke a hole through after I attach them on the bottom so that the air can get in there to dry them out. If the air doesn't get in there to dry it out, then the inside doesn't dry, and when we go to fire it, your sprig will pop off. So I'm just going to put my slip onto the sprig itself. And then I'm going to press that firmly onto my platter while it's still on the mold. Clean off my excess slip. And then I'm just going to blend the edges of this into the bottom of my platter. Again, so it looks like one piece of clay. Anytime we blend stuff together or attach two things, most of the time we're going to want it to look like it's one piece of clay. Like it was always meant to be together. Again, using my modeling tool kind of as an extension of my finger to get it process started. And then I'm just going to go in with my finger and clean it up. Through this whole process, you'll notice I'm not using a sponge either. A lot of times with what a sponge will actually do is if you wet the surface, you're just going to take a layer of slip off the clay. And you're going to expose all the sandy grog that's in the clay. And the surface is going to become rough. If you want to keep that nice smooth surface, you're better off using your finger because it'll push that grog underneath that top layer of clay and it'll give you a nice clean smooth surface to work with. Putting the sprigs on where I did, I know this plate isn't going to sit like perfectly square to the surface, and that's okay. I didn't want it to. Otherwise, I could have marked the bottom and evenly spread them out so that my plate would sit perfectly and all my corners would be at the same height. I kind of wanted it offset a little bit just to add a different element of design to it. And this works. I mean, the shape of this doesn't really matter. You can make it square, you can make it rectangle, it can be football shaped, it can be leaf shaped, but, you know, anything you want to make shape-wise, as long as it fits on the mold, works. It doesn't have to be square. So keep that in mind as you're starting to design your raised platter that we will eventually raku fire. And then again on this last one, smoothing it out with my finger so that it blends into the platter. It all looks like it was always intended to be together. Again, I just used a sprig mold to make these bottoms feet. There are some different shapes in there that you could use. Okay, and then once this is blended real well, again, the last thing I need to do is I carved holes in those sprigs. So I just want to take my needle tool. I'm just going to poke right through the bottom. I don't want to poke all the way through my plate. I just want to poke through the bottom of the sprig. And that's just enough to let that air out so the inside can dry out and it's not going to pop off during firing. And that's really important to making sure everything stays together and stays dry. It's not that things blow up in the kiln. They usually just fall apart at their weakest points. So we want to make sure that we don't make this the weakest point by allowing the air to escape through the hole. So once we have it all set up, we can take our plaster mold off of our bat. We can flip it. And I can lift my plaster mold off of my platter. And I'm left with this platter that I can clean up the edges. Again, I used some stamps on this slab. I'd probably do more so that it was planned as far as where the stamps fall on here. But that was just a slab I had that I could use easily for this. So I'd clean up my edges, maybe soften them with my sponge and then run over with my finger so that I don't have that groggy edge. And then this would be ready to dry out so that we can raku it.